Live from the SABC's Auckland Park studios. Welcome to this Tuesday edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvoko, and on the show tonight...
Just sit down and raise your hand and say point of order.
Opposition MPs go for broke, pressing the president for answers on the Phala Phala farm saga. They also wanted to hear what he thinks of Police Minister Cele's comment that one of the 8 women gang raped at a Krugersdorp unused mine recently was lucky she was only raped by one man. Or what he makes of the Limpopo Health MEC's Zimbabwe patient rent. We bring you highlights as well as some analysis of what transpired in Parliament today. Sorting the problem may not have stopped today's disruptions, but the sitting once again brought into sharp focus the need to urgently sort out Parliament's accommodation issues. Tonight on the show, we ask the new Secretary to Parliament how he plans to deal with the challenge following those January fires that gutted some of the legislature's key buildings. The Watchdog starts now.
The rules say we must stand up.
No, don't. Just sit down and raise your hand and say point of order.
But the rules say we must...
No.
But the rule says we must stand up. Confirm the rules.
But guys, can
we
you
are not going
imagine
to run
all of
Parliament.
us stood up?
We won't run Parliament according to your feelings.
I, for one, said, can we at least lead our people in a way that they will continuously respect us?
I'm not going to allow you now, Honorable Shibambo. We are now continuing with the business of... I'm not going... Because you are diverting us from what we are trying to do. Honorable Malema, please, no comments again.
What do you mean?
Order speak.
Shibambo.
On a point of order speak.
Don't do that.
In terms of Rule 69. Rule 69 is against the abuse of the point of order to disrupt the proceedings.
I hear the people who are speaking about turning Parliament into street bashes. So we have not been to street bashes. So regulars will know how street bashes run.
Lamula must withdraw. Lamula must withdraw. Unparliamentary. To call President a liar.
How does he choose a party of attending street bashes? Lamula must withdraw now.
I'm still on the floor, Speaker.
No, but you're down now.
How do you know, Speaker?
No, but you've told me the essence.
No, I didn't say that.
The essence of what?
My point of order can be in 2 parts.
Honorable Mente, will you please leave the house?
There is context to everything.
Honorable Mente.
Honorable
Mente.
You are not going to sit here and intimidate my members.
Honorable Mente.
It will never happen.
Honorable the women PPS members to usher Honorable Mente out. Thank you.
Well, again today, as was the case the last time, it took about an hour for President Cyril Ramaphosa to be allowed to begin answering questions in the National Assembly, following a lot of the heckling and interjections that you just saw there. Now, the questions that no doubt got many hot under the collar were around the president's Phala Phala farm saga, to which this was his initial response.
The focus that the various agencies are putting on this matter demonstrates the importance of this matter and the way they are dealing with it. I have responded to the various questions that have been raised and will continue to respond to all questions that have been put to me by the relevant authorities. Now, in the course of what they are working on, the authorities have said it's best if they deal with all these attendant matters to this theft that occurred at the farm and be able to address every issue. And I've been counseled and advised that it is best to address this matter when those processes have been done. And I'd like to say, I stand ready, Honorable Speaker, to, as people have said, take the nation into its confidence. I stand ready to do so, to give an explanation.
Before we go further, let me bring into the conversation political analyst Asanda Ngwasheng, who watched today's proceedings. That, of course, what we just saw there, Asanda, was the president's initial response. And then, after that response, obviously, a lot of the opposition MP made no secret of the fact that they were unhappy, with that response.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that they were unhappy with that response, because this is kind of classic Cyril Ramaphosa. He's done this kind of, ignorance of what he's meant to talk about and what he's meant to provide clarity on. He passes it on to legal authorities, who he then says have told him not to speak. If you remember the scandal very early on in his presidency with who funded his CR campaign, and there he basically had the exact same strategy of obfuscate, pass on to legal entities who have given him, have basically told him not to speak further while the investigation goes on, etc., until eventually we forget whatever it was that we're asking questions about and we move on. And so I'm not surprised that Cyril Ramaphosa responded in the way that he did. And I'm also not surprised that, the EFF in particular responded in the way that it did, because this is also what the EFF does, where when it doesn't get the kind of responses that it wants, it tends to just disrupt Parliament and kind of cause this kind of ruckus. And one of the questions I'm beginning to have, and it's very interesting for me because I'm one of those people who used to support the EFF in the strategy of disruption of Parliament. I'm beginning to feel like the EFF needs a new strategy of disruption. And I'm also beginning to believe that the South African Parliament in general really needs to re-engage its purpose and, what exactly its function is. Because what I'm seeing right now is that opposition parties are not always using different kind of strategies, and they're not always using strategies that can deliver answers, which is what South Africans want on any and all the issues that have been raised. And I feel like Parliament is becoming yet again, this institution where the ANC goes and says what it will, the EFF comes and disrupts, the DA asks these very interesting questions, and then we all call it a day, and everybody feels like they've done something, and yet nothing has happened. The question that was initially posed hasn't really been answered. The opposition parties haven't really held the executive to account in the way that they're supposed to, using the tool that they have, which is the legislature.
Quite a number of issues that you're raising there, Asanda. Of course, the arguments went on for hours on end. Okay, in between there were other issues which we're going to talk about in a second, but I just want to stay for a while with the issue of the Phala Phala farm saga. About an hour, maybe 2 hours ago or so, the question came back via the leader of the ATM, and the president giving pretty much the response he gave initially, which we played earlier. And that's when now, opposition MP after opposition MP came to say, you've got to answer the question. And here are some of the issues that some of them actually raised during that long, it must be said, a conversation about how to proceed and whether, in fact, the president had answered the question or not, and what should happen next. Take a listen.
The president has not answered. We can't accept his explanation about law enforcement agencies and everything that he has stated. The purpose of asking questions, and we in Parliament follow a process whereby the NA table approves those questions. It is because we want answers.
Honorable Zugula is indeed right in saying the question has not been answered. There has not been an attempt on the part of the president to respond to the question, or to try to attempt to even give an answer. Uguti, the law must take its course and whatnot, does not address Lendo Sibuza Apa.
He can answer in all other processes except Parliament, where he must really account to. He says, so many questions came to me, and I've answered those questions, but I'm not going to answer to you. He says he can answer everybody else but Parliament. And then someone stands up here, like they did during Zuma's era, yes, answers sufficiently, singing for supper. It's not correct.
I don't know what you made of, that part of the proceedings. I mean, Asanda, number of issues being raised. Procedural issues, how the motion was filed, for example. Everyone agreed, including the speaker and the other whips, including the whips of the ANC, that it was procedurally filed. And then it went to the role of government, that even there may be all these other processes that the president mentioned, but Parliament, he has an obligation, he and the rest of the executive have an obligation to actually account to Parliament.
Yeah, the ANC is used to getting away with presidents who do not respond, is used to having, the legislature be its rubber stamping authority, and they're used to getting away with answering as they will or as they want, or not answering at all. And so, that's why I said that the EFF and all these other opposition political parties need to find new strategies to hold the executive to account, to hold the president, the executive, and in particular the governing party to account, because obviously disrupting Parliament is not good enough. It's not having the intended consequences. It's not having the intended response. We've seen that with Zuma, that after some time it stopped being effective at all. And so you would think that there would be a new kind of structure or strategy that the organization would come up with that seeks to hold the president to account. There are many instruments that are available to them. And some of these have been exercised, for example, during the Zuma era, which is going to court, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the kind of thing that if they're not getting the kind of answers they want in Parliament, they should by now have been looking into or have brought a case against the president to force him to account. And there are many other structures within the law that allow opposition parties to be able to start asking the questions, but also ensuring that they get the kind of answers that they deserve, and not just South Africa.
I want to explore that further, because I think in between that's grey areas. I think there may well be a bit of an identity crisis, if you like, because where does the work of Parliament start and stop, and where do other processes then kick in the event of a breakdown or the chaos that we've been seeing? But before we get there, I just wanted to take a listen to what ANC MPs, some of them, had to say in defense of the president.
Sitting here, the president has adequately answered the question. And he has even referred to him being accountable. And so this is why you are saying you will not be able to prescribe. But
I really think that the president has adequately answered the question. I will appreciate the speaker to invoke Rule 92 and also Rule 142, such that if the member is aggrieved, they knows what to do so that the matter can go to in-committees.
When questions are raised to the executive, what you are minimally entitled to is the response. 2, we don't have a memorandum here, like at school, where when we ask you a question and there's a prescribed way how to answer it.
See, I mean, this is where a lot of things got thrown up asunder. I mean, prescription. In other words, ANCMP is being saying the opposition is being prescriptive, and the minister in the presidency talking about minimal entitlement, which loosely translated could then mean that all you need to do as a member of an executive is stand up, give an answer. Whether you have answered the question or not is neither here nor there. That's, of course, the loose, interpretation of what they were saying, which is something scary considering where we are coming from, the era we are coming from. When questions had to be asked about Nkandla and a whole range of things.
I mean, I think that, we are coming to the realization late that this particular president has found various interesting ways of ducking and diving accountability at different turns. So if you think about it, he hardly ever answers questions to media, for example, which is another, important institution of democracy. And now he's got a repeated history of not answering questions at Parliament, which is yet another arm of democratic institutions. And I think that the reason why I'm saying that I don't feel like opposition politicians are using all of the tools at their disposal is precisely because after the first time the president said almost word for word, copy for copy, what he has said today about where, the investigation is, et cetera, by now, the security cluster should have been brought to to the security committee, right? The committee that's in charge of security, etc., in the country, to answer as to what is happening with the investigation, where is the investigation, and what are the next steps, so that we don't have to wait for the president to say it a second time that it's with, the correct institutions.
What about,
and as I said,
what about relooking the rules, perhaps? Because I don't know, I'm no expert in these things, but allowing people to continue raising points of order endlessly has that disruptive effect, and it doesn't really take the conversation anywhere. And then they start hurling insults at one another, and we are deprived the opportunity of hearing our legislators actually debating and discussing and taking decisions on matters of life and death in many instances. So is it not perhaps about time that the rules are actually relooked to, one, break the deadlocks, but to ensure that there is progress? In other words, it's not just politicians having fun among themselves or embarrassing one another, and that's the end all and be all.
I don't think that the problem is necessarily the rules, right? I think that the problem is the implementation and the reading of the rules. So as you said it earlier, that the ANC's reading of the bare minimum requirement in a Q&A is flawed, and it is, right? And they can continue to have it be this way because they have the majority in Parliament. And ultimately, if they say that it's sufficiently answered, then it's sufficiently answered. And so the question is not so much about the rules. I don't think the rules are necessarily restrictive, but the question is more what happens when the rules are kind of crafted or enclosed in ways that serve the governing party of the ANC. And this is where the the opposition politicians are meant to be providing us with leadership, are meant to be providing us with alternatives, and are meant to be actively seeking their various ways and channels of engaging the presidency, of engaging the security cluster, and of engaging all the different bodies that are in charge of our democracy and ensuring that separation of powers continues to be in place. Because if they use, for example, making sure that the committee that's in charge of security sits with the security cluster and starts asking the tough questions of the people who are in charge of security in this country, then we might get somewhere in terms of answers, because it's clear that the president is not going to give us the answers, but he's not the only person that has the answers. And then the second thing is that there needs to be a concerted effort to ensure that when the president doesn't answer, isn't, being held accountable, isn't responding to media, isn't responding to anybody in parliament, that the opposition politicians are supposed to be looking at what exists in law already.
Okay, I want to ask you about. I want to ask you about one or two, other things outside of this, Phala Phala farm saga and the drama that ensued in Parliament today. But before I do that, I want to bring out a couple of tweets. I believe that we have people who have expressed who are watching and who have expressed their views on this. Our Parliament has become a circus because ruling party is defending Mr. Ramaphosa while the man has to answer Phala Phala farm saga. This is Lekhasa Batla Mollo Zebediela Mokopong. Mr. President must do an honorable thing to come in person and answer the MP's questions. This thing of speakers protecting the corrupt president must come to an end. But Tuvulawi Nangovela says EFF is not respecting nation because every time they like to disrupt at the parliament and their leader doesn't have a responsibility when he speaks. Mr. President, he is not denying to respond any questions. Some of the views let's take a last one. I say Ramaphosa must account for Phala Phala saga and must answer. Ramaphosa is a money launderer and he must be held accountable for his crimes. Resign with immediate effect. EFF South Africa will make sure that Ramaphosa is accountable. Some of the views, being expressed by people who are watching. Last two quick ones, Asanda, if I may. He was asked, the MPs wanted to know what he thinks of Police Minister Cele's comment recently that one of the 8 women who were gang raped at that Kruger stop, unused mine, was, and I quote, lucky that she was only raped by one man. And his answer was, well, I think, what the minister had to say, or his answer to that question, was lost in the translation.
I think that, this is yet another case that kind of reminds us that people in leadership don't always know how to deal with or engage with sensitive issues. Because were it an ordinary person who had made that comment, maybe as South Africans, we might have found some kind of level of understanding that maybe they meant something different to what they said. But as the Minister of Police, he has a responsibility to think very carefully and choose his words very carefully, particularly when talking about this issue of rape in South Africa, because no woman should have to face rape in the first place. And so to say that one is lucky that it was one but not a gang that raped them, even if they are, comparing it to other women who experienced a gang rape, it doesn't sit well with people. And it's quite triggering and quite, a reminder of just how little somebody in such a high position of power understands the crime of rape, that one rape on its own is devastating, never mind a rape, by a gang. And so just because she was only raped by one woman, by one person, it doesn't mean that the trauma is any less, so that, the pain that she will have to go through is any less, or has any less of a negative impact. And it's about, how we choose the people who are in leadership, and the kind of training that they provided or not provided, and the kind of thinking that they are allowed to articulate in the public, and we're seeing it increasingly. I mean, it's kind of always been a thing that ANC people do. Bheki in particular has done this before when there was the whole case, in Cape Town, and how he responded to people who were asking him to account about the state of policing or the lack of policing, for instance, in Cape Town, and he got away with it that time. He's gotten away with a comment now about GBV. He'll probably get away with a comment about something else in the future. But for me, it's always just a reminder of kind of how low the bar is when it comes to the African National Congress and the kind of people that are in leadership and the kind of engagement and the kind of utterances that they are allowed to get away with without sanction. And we know that if you can't hold the president to account, then there's no way you're going to hold, anybody else that's in his cabinet to account. And this is why I keep putting the ball back in the court of opposition parties to say they continue to fail us. We know the ANC has failed us as a country, but opposition parties continue to fail us by not constantly and consistently searching for alternative means within the law to question, to challenge, and to hold not only the executive to account, but the entire ANC caucus and governing party to account for everything that they're doing and they have done and continue to do.
Quick one for you. It's a direct question. Mwasheng, I used support EFF strategies in Parliament, but not anymore. Was it because it was Zuma? Now it's Cyril. Asanda knows how ANC used majority to protect their own. What do you have to say for yourself?
I mean, I think the beauty of living in a democracy is that I'm allowed to change my mind. So when they used to use it, the strategy initially, it was novel, it was interesting, it was something different, it was something that hadn't been tried before. But it's been, more than 10 years of using the same strategy. It's tired now. And so they need to find a new strategy. And honestly, I think I'm allowed to declare that there was a stage when I used to support something and I don't, because it doesn't make sense anymore. And I think, it's a waste of time to continue to do, there's a saying that to do the same thing over and over and have the same results and continue to do it is a sign of madness. And so if the EFF cares about, its future and cares about delivering political strategy that has impact, the least they can do is relook the kind of strategies that they use and how they use those strategies and when they use the strategies. The one of disrupting Parliament, there was a time when it was effective. There was a time when it kind of got our attention. Now it's boring and it's tired and they need to find new strategies. And the same goes for all the other opposition parties, because we are here. I want to just remind people of this. We are where we are because the political opposition continues to fail us and continues to not deliver a viable alternative to the ANC. If they did that, people would vote for them more. We would already have a government of national unity and we would already be rid of the ANC. But they continue to fail us. And that is why we are in the state that we are. I mean, I think
let's leave it there, Asanda. Okay, let's leave it there. Let's leave it there for tonight. Thanks very much for your time. Asanda Mwasheng, political analyst, and no stranger, of course, to this program. After the break, I sit down with the new Secretary to Parliament. You can join the conversation by tweeting us your questions, comments. The handles will be on your screen. Don't go away. He's been in the job for just over 2 months now, and as the events of this afternoon once again showed, he needs to move with speed to ensure the nation's parliamentarians have a place where they can meet and discuss. Mr. Goyle George, welcome to the Watchdog.
Good evening, Vuyo. Good evening to Watchdog listeners.
So how has it been?
Well,
a different animal from being a Saga CEO.
Yeah. Well, I think it's both an exciting responsibility. At the same time, one is aware of the enormity of the task at hand. Because as you join this premier institution, in the democratic edifice of the country. One can only be expected to hit the ground running. And even as you are expected to do so, there's even more serious pressures, the incidences that have affected the psyche of South Africans, the fire devastation that befell Parliament on the 2nd of January this year. So it adds to the urgency and complexity of the task at hand for a person who must assume the role of Secretary of Parliament to make the institution work, make the institution function, and ensure that you support the institution, both houses of Parliament, but at the same time also to ensure that there's a synergized model of interface with our legislatures. At the same time to ensure that the business of both houses, the National Council of Provinces as well as the National Assembly, is able to respond to the core mandates of Parliament, that of lawmaking, that of performing oversight over the performance of government and all its entities, but also the mandate of ensuring that participatory democracy complements representative democracy in terms of public participation, that our people must participate in lawmaking and be kept abreast on issues of substantive interest to them in terms of the national dialogue. So one is joining that institution knowing that over the last 2 months, huge expectations have been placed on your shoulders. Chief amongst those is to continue allow Parliament to make sure that with all the limitations that are imposed by the burning down of the two houses in terms of the new wing of the National Assembly and the old wing, provides as minimum as possible the disruption to the function of Parliament. And so far, one is occupied to ensure that we assist Parliament and members to perform their responsibilities in the best they can possibly do pre-COVID.
In fact, I'm hoping we can play a clip from what, one of the MPs, leader of one of the opposition parties, Julius Malema, had to say earlier today, which speaks directly to, what you have just raised.
Speaker, we were meeting in a manner we're meeting now during COVID-19. And we cannot, when the regulations have been scrapped, continue to meet in this manner we're meeting, because you are doing this deliberately to protect the executive, to be held accountable properly, because you're micromanaging us through switching off the microphones and then removing some of us from the platforms. All we're asking is, let this Parliament be postponed today, and there must be a proper sitting of members of Parliament, all of us. The way we are constituted, it is extremely wrong. There are no longer COVID restrictions. Postpone the sitting, arrange a proper venue, and allow all of us to come under one roof. Because the way you are doing is tantamount to protecting the president of the ANC and the executive from being held properly accountable to Parliament. It's our duty to hold these people accountable.
What's the thinking around going back to normal, for lack of a better?
Well, as you say, for lack of a better word, but there's objective reality on the ground. We don't have Parliament in terms of what pre-COVID provided, and there was lockdown, and Parliament had to adapt and change to make sure that at least continuation of the business of Parliament would continue, albeit on not so ideal conditions. And Parliament has functioned, and both by adopting technological capabilities that allow members to work remotely, other members to work physically, so the so-called hybrid functioning of committees of Parliament, plenary sittings, and business of Parliament has been processed. But it is also correct that it is much more ideal if we were to have formal sittings of the House, especially after the restrictions of COVID.
Look, I mean, if you listen to, what the leader of the EFF had to say, there's no doubt politicking being part of, everything that was being said here. But has Parliament taken a view as to what to do temporarily? In other words, a temporary arrangement that will go as far as possible in ensuring that you go as far as possible again to things being normal.
Well, yes, there is assessment that is being done to consider those options. You look at the impact of the fire that happened. Parliament lost the National Assembly, the chamber. It also lost the old wing of the Assembly. That affects the normal sittings of plenaries, both at a joint sitting as well as the National Assembly sittings. Secondly, members of Parliament lost about 473 offices, gutted down. Administration of Parliament lost offices. We have lost archives. It's extensive damage that has been visited on the institution. So what we have done now in June to date, at least we have managed to restore one house that was also partially affected, the National Council of Provinces. We have now finished work on it, and that house is able to sit fully, both on a hybrid capacity as well as physical. So one component of the house is now sorted, even though that only gives you limited seating, because it gives you 90.
It's much smaller
seats,
compared to the National Assembly.
Compared to the NA, but you are able to have restoration of plenary sittings that members this week, committees have been sitting, plenaries have been sitting. On the offices, we are now working very hard to make sure at least we can even adapt our own administrative offices. We have identified offices in one of our buildings, 2 buildings, where we are likely to yield more than 155 office space for members, and we would run short of 74 offices to be able to complete the provision of offices to all members, because NCOP gives us 74. The sittings of joint housing, as you would have seen, the temporary measures applied even at SONA, Vuyo.
Where you bring in...
We had to engage with the City of Cape Town to borrow us the City Hall, and we're grateful as Parliament that they have made us to be able to ensure that the State of the Nation would be able to be delivered by the President in that sitting. We're looking at the same option now for the next State of the Nation address around provision. The NA, as members are all desirous, we are also looking at ways where we are able to provide, and we're in discussion with the city as at last week to make sure that they can also make available the City Hall as one option in terms of us servicing both joint sittings as well as plenary basis. We're also looking at interim measures. What has been done so far, buildings of Parliament fall under the overall management of public works as state properties. An assessment has been done for the damaged building, and the report indicates to us what options are there. Restoration, rebuilding of Parliament, and those options are now being processed internally. So at the right decision-making level, those decisions are taken about whether to take the route of restoration with cost dimensions that we have now quantified that will inform that period. Sadly, for you,
before you move on that, I mean, are we talking about, this is where we're talking about what, more than 2 billion rands work that would have to be undertaken over 3 years?
Well, we're talking about estimates. The estimates that have now been communicated to restore the new wing of the National Assembly, to be able to get it to a state of functionality, restoration of all operation systems and infrastructure. You are talking at a quite significant amount of money of more than 1.4 billion rand around doing that. But dressing up the institution also deals with the old wing. So viewed collectively, you also look at options like the issue of identifying a site. If we were not to succeed with City Hall, we need to look at a site that would help Parliament to be able to construct at a speedy rate the alternative accommodation that can be used. But so far, the preliminary assessment done is that even to undertake that work, it would not immediately buy you in the shortest period. It might be anything between 24 months to 36 months to restore both houses. Simultaneously, it might also take us 12 to 24 months to be able to provide an interim solution, given the scale of what you need, more than 490 provision, the gathering of the assemble at a joint level, offices and so on. So we're looking at those options, but what is urgent, Vuyo, is that decision-making point, we envisage that it must be taken as fast as possible in terms of the long-term restoration. But what we're involved as Parliament administration is to make sure that the short-term provision must ensure that members receive support, members are able to continue, offices, infrastructure is provided, and we have seen the first quarter and second quarter view. Work of Parliament, despite all these constraints, has been happening very well. But
I do want to check just for clarity. You're saying that the 2 billion rands estimate over perhaps up to 3 years would only entails restoring the National Assembly to its original condition, more or less. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, Vuyo, but it is not like for like restoration. Yes. Remember, these buildings have been built long time ago, 1600 and 1800 and so on. So to be able to say it will be like for like may also not provide opportunity to even retrofit some of the areas so that they can meet some of the building standards that otherwise the scenario we had before the fire was also not meeting standard conditions. So yes, it talk about the National Assembly new wing as well as the old wing of the Assembly to be able to restore at the same time, dress it up for the occasion, to be able to take the numbers that we had, because you must also accommodate the public. You might talk about 490 member, but you are also talking about the public, you are talking about institutions that come, the Chapter 9s and so on. So it's quite a significant amount of work that building industry estimates may require between 36 up to 42 months, bar any issues that may be unforeseen around those matters. So it means at best, we need to find short-term answers to make sure that the desires and wishes of members to operate in the best possible way that was pre-disruption is restored, and we are seized with that matter to make sure that we can secure spaces where Parliament can meet physically and operations of committees as well as plenaries as well as joint settings is happening, Vuyo, in a manner that supports the proper functioning and discharge of responsibilities of members.
Did you say that Public Works did the estimations, assessments and evaluation? No one else was involved or sort of had input? No. The reason I'm asking this is because when, for example, assessments were, done, to what extent was how big was the damage and what may need to be done, if at all possible, to perhaps bring some of the areas into, you involved people like Kucha, and there were other outsiders involved who had expert views. Mention was made at some point of engineering councils and the like, because I would imagine you would want to avoid a situation where someone comes around, let's say people have discussions and then decide to approve, one proposition or the other, and then later on someone says, hang on a minute, this was daylight robbery. All these things that you're saying could cost 3 billion can actually cost 1 billion.
Well,
so to sort of
mitigate those issues. Yes. No, definitely, Vuyo. This is an assessment report conducted by technical experts appointed by Public Works, as you say. Kucha indeed was involved on a multidisciplinary team. We have met with them. I have also met with Public Works, and I'm now engaging with National Treasury at a technical level to present the findings of those reports, working with Public Works, so at least the urgency of ensuring that funding resources are identified in the medium-term budget policy statement to resource what is clearly an extraordinary occasion that affects South Africans, that also affects Parliament and affects administration of Parliament. So it is quite an urgent matter that once all these assessments are done, decisions will be made at the right level in Parliament in terms of the institution taking such decision at the right level to determine the next course of action. Ours is to make sure that at this point, the continuation of the work of committees, the continuation of the work of plenaries, which in the first 2 quarters, Vuyo, as we sit around 19 August, 51 bills are currently being processed to pass legislation between 2 houses. And there's more than 375 sittings of committees, both virtual and on a hybrid basis. There has been oversight conducted in more than 21 institutions producing reports. So indeed, even in the not so ideal circumstances,
work is being done.
Parliament is able to discharge its responsibilities. We've got committees now that are running in 2 provinces on human settlements. They are also in the Limpopo and Northwest, looking at fisheries and bills. And all of that work also allows Parliament to be able to sit and process legislation at the same time, allow the public review all of budgets. 41 budgets have been passed in terms of budget votes. The public involvement is there. So it's not so ideal because you also want to have...
Where's the medium-term budget statement going to be done from?
We will have to identify the venue. So far, we are looking at the city of Cape Town. If it were to be the agreement of the House that it would want a full sitting for the tabling of that, or it might be done on a virtual basis. At current, for instance, in June, the President presented his budget vote on a hybrid basis because of limitations of numbers we have in one of our facilities. So if we have to look for a bigger facility, the most immediate available one is what we have used for SONA. And we'll be looking at those facilities around this matter. So the point for you is that performance of the institution is happening. We are ensuring that it must be discharged in a manner that supports proper functioning of Parliament to carry out its constitutional responsibilities, to hold the executive accountable, to pass laws, enable the public to participate. But this is not the ideal. Ours is to show that urgently Parliament is restored, or a decision of what needs to be done is taken to inform the best decision that must ensure that this premier institution of our country and for our people is able to be restored to function at its best again.
Of course, I mean, you can't have all these conversations between and among yourselves, between yourselves and Treasury, between yourselves and the people who will have to make the decision at the end of the day. You can't conclude a conversation about spending, say, 3 billion rands, without, of course, addressing that big elephant in the room about whether or not this Parliament even stays in Cape Town. Are the people who are supposed to take those decisions taking that into account? In other words, before you even begin to have a conversation about whether or not you're going to spend 3 billion rands, can you answer the first question first about whether Parliament stays in Cape Town or not? Are they alive to that reality?
Well, very much so, Vuyo. Work was done in terms of committing from the 5th administration to this 6th administration of Parliament that there must be thoroughgoing work done in determining whether Parliament can consider relocating, and if it were to relocate, where. So assessments were done on the basis of one site at the time that was determined, and further work was then taken in terms of committing that there must be what is called socio-economic assessment of an impact if such a decision were to be carried out and executed. And that socio-economic assessment has also been done around this matter. But that's a separate matter. It's about relocating Parliament. That was pre-fire and pre-COVID. We now have a reality.
Well, now that the unfortunate has happened, I mean, you can't now kind of park that conversation.
No, not at all.
Because whatever is going to happen
next, going
next,
to have a material impact.
Exactly.
No, it's not to say it has to be parked and treated as a pre-issue. I'm just indicating that there were certain factors considered at that time. Those factors are now more pronounced because of the reality that we have on the ground. And so far, the assessment is about the damage of what has happened on the fire. Of course, in considering the decision, those matters would have been to be discussed and considered. But what South Africans should also know is that regardless of a separate decision of relocation, so we're talking about restoration, another one is a relocation, conditioned by different circumstances. Whatever decision that has to be taken, in terms of the Constitution, if we were to leave the building in its current form, you have an obligation to restore it anyway. So restoration is an unavoidable commitment that you have to do first because of the provision of the National Heritage Act. This is a historical institutions. So any movement out of that place with this condition it is in, it demands of us that we must first restore the institution.
Whose job is that going to be? And I'm asking this now because, I mean, what you've touched on is very important. Because when a couple of days ago these numbers were thrown around, people started asking, but where's the money going to come from? So I'm asking that question, especially in light of what you're saying now, that even if you were, say, a decision was taken to, vacate the current premises, whose job is it going to be to
take the decision?
Not to restore it if it was. Let's just say Parliament decides to, look, we don't want this building anymore. We think we'll be better served elsewhere, right? Whose job is it going to be to restore it? In the same way, I'm also asking at the same time that whose job is it going to be to pay for the repairs that would have to be undertaken?
Well, Vuyo, in a situation like this, where you have a constrained fiscus, there's multiple competing issues, and then you have an extraordinary set of circumstances happening, like the fire in Parliament. There has to be money made available from the national fiscus, albeit under very constrained conditions. So 2 billion is not a small amount of money. So it means rigorous assessment of the figures, proper interrogation has to be done to make sure that every cent that is estimated to be expenditure, it meets the expectation that this is real expenditure. And I think Parliament will be able to put measures in place around setting up proper advisory committees around that work. But restoration of the Houses of Parliament, Parliament has a responsibility to do that. Currently, in terms of management of the buildings, it is managed by Public Works. But those are parliamentary buildings. So any other decision of relocation will have to be twinned with the reality that you still have to restore the buildings into the condition in which they are because of the provisions that are there for any facility of a national heritage like that, and also take into account that Parliament in its own sitting is determined as by the Constitution of the Republic. And the Constitution also make provision, if they were to be changed, there will have to be a national consultative process because of the meaning of Parliament and what it means to South Africans. If there were to be any such decision, there will have to be a well-canvassed process, which Parliament itself will be able to make a decision. Ours will be to run with a decision that says, continue restoration, follow A, B, C, and D. This is the committee, any that we need to report to, that Parliament may consider establishing to lead that process. But what needs to be done is to restore Parliament and also ensure that functioning of Parliament is restored to its best possible, even if it is not the most optimum conditions. And we're glad that it is functioning, but it also gives us an opportunity to rethink some of the processes. If you can have your situation where otherwise you would have one committee going to Lisikisiki on Education Portfolio Committee. Tomorrow, you need to relocate to Mpumalanga. Today, you are able to make sure that you can maximize on mobility. And perhaps some of these issues, albeit being brought by negative conditions, they also help us to strengthen and optimize our work going forward. And Parliament will be seized with that. At least on our side as administration, is to help the institution discharge responsibility to the best of its capacity.
Okay, well, hopefully those who have to take the big decisions will take those decisions sooner rather than later, if not for anything else, for all the political reasons that have a lot to do with what we saw transpiring this afternoon in the National Assembly sitting, which involved the president. That's our show for tonight. Do join us again tomorrow evening, same time. Have a good night, and special thanks to you, sir.
Thank you very much for you.